Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on early modern and now into modern church history. For those of you who have been following this sequentially, you will notice that there was a hiatus in the uploads that's attributable to the occurrence of Holy Week, as well as the coincidence in time of my second COVID injection, which had deleterious side effects, a description of which I will spare you. And that was followed by some issues in the parish where I'm assigned, plumbing issues, air conditioning issue, other issues. With regard, I have to say, seminarians, the church has four air conditioning units at the four corners. Well, the one that's broken is someone thought it was a good idea to brick the equipment in so that the only way to replace this device is to demolish the bricks. And oh, God. And then the bricks that nobody makes. They're these, no doubt when it was put up, somebody thought they were nifty and original and creative, but nobody makes them. So they. Anyways, just be careful what you do. If it ever comes that you have to build a church or renovate a church, be careful what you let architects talk you into. Just know that somewhere down the line, either you or one of the brother priests is going to have to deal with someone trying to be creative. All right. Now, the next thing, more immediate concern, for the this course, I may put it on YouTube for everyone, but obviously it's for seminarians specifically. And we run into a time problem. I can never cover as much as I want. But I do want to get to Vatican II, so I'm jumping forward, leaving the early modern and just going straight to the modern period, which begins with the French Revolution. So I'll pick up there today and then just keep going until we get to Vatican II. And I think there's enough time in the semester to get there, doing it sequentially from that point on. If not, then I'll just at some point jump forward to at least get through Vatican II. And then for those of you who were just following this for your own interest, I hope to go back later and fill in the gap. There's also another gap like this that occurred in the last round between the medieval and the early modern. So I hope to fill all of that in anyway. So we're jumping forward, and today we will begin with the reign of the 250th Pope, Pope Pius VI. It was in his reign that the French Revolution began, and we see coming together many of the destructive tendencies that we've been following really since the fall of the Roman Empire and the Patristic course, and we see them explode into a complete bloodbath. And a generation, literally generational, from the French Revolution on, and up until the final defeat of Napoleon, was 26 years of almost continuous warfare. So a generational bloodbath. But we'll begin here with Pope 250. The previous Pope, 249, was Pope Clement XIV. He died on September 22nd, 1774, at the age of 68. He was condemned and regarded with contempt by sincere Catholics for having surrendered to pressure from corrupt, allegedly Catholic monarchies to suppress the Jesuit order. And that occurred, the document Dominus Ac Redemptor, dated July 21st, 1773. Now we'll cover this in the fourth year course in more detail from a different perspective, because the first bishop in the United States was was caught in this, that he was actually a Jesuit priest, John Carroll, and he had been a Jesuit priest for 14 years, and when the order was suppressed, and so he just became what we would now call a diocesan priest, and then later became the founding bishop in the United States, of the first diocese, the Diocese of Baltimore. But the short version of this is, of course, it was orchestrated by Satan for purposes of theft. At the monarchies, as we'll see, this whole lead up to the French Revolution, the economies are all collapsing because of the pointless, endless warfare between all these countries. And we'll get into some more of the details specifically. But they were all collapsing, so they were looking, to replenish their treasuries. And even these Catholic monarchies sought to do that by just stealing church property. The Jesuits were a convenient target because it was an easily identifiable religious order. They had made many enemies for a number of reasons. Previous popes, before Clement XIV, resisted, but finally Clement XIV gave in and suppressed them. Now, his true motive in doing this was just to avoid a schism, that he was afraid some of the countries, Spain, Portugal, it's actually started in Portugal, Spain, Naples, France. He was afraid that they would go into schism, leave the church. But he, of course, he couldn't put that in the official document. So in the enabling decree of suppression, Dominus Ac Redemptor, he explained it, and I won't read the whole document, but just in part, picking up sort of further down after the document began, quote, "One clearly gathers that in the society," meaning the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, "that in the society, almost from its beginning, seeds of dissension and rivalry grew. The discord was not only among members, but also with members of other religious orders, with the secular clergy, with academies, with universities, with public schools of letters, and even with princes in whose realms the society had been received. The debates and differences were stirred up concerning the type and nature of the vows, the time of admission to profession, the faculty of dismissing members, the advancement of members to sacred orders without a suitable title and without final vows, which advancement is against the decrees of the Council of Trent and of our predecessor, Pope Pius V. Further, dissension arose concerning the absolute power which the Society's Father General wields, and about other matters pertaining to the governance of the Society. There was debate on various doctrinal topics, on the schools, on the exemptions and privileges which local ordinaries and other persons with ecclesiastical or secular authority contended were harmful to their jurisdiction and rights. And finally, there was no lack of very grave accusations against members that caused no little disturbance to the peace and tranquility of the Christian commonwealth. Hence, many complaints were made against the Society. Some princes backed these complaints with their authority and reports. Indeed, it happens that, and then I'll skip down to the end. Indeed, it happens that scarcely, or not all, can the true and lasting peace of the Church be restored as long as the Society is intact. Accordingly, we are moved by these grave reasons and are pressed by other considerations that the laws of prudence and the best government of the universal Church impose upon us, and which we keep stored deeply in our mind. We take away and abrogate each and every one of its offices and ministries. And then it lists more specific things. Given at Rome, St. Maria Maggiore, 21st July 1773, the 5th year of our pontificate. Okay, so if I do get to go back and eventually I will, and fill in the gap, I'll cover more in detail what happened. But it was motivated by theft, and we know this because in the nations where the society was suppressed, the government nationalized the Jesuit property, which the schools and other property and that they had, the churches, all the sacred vessels, melted down. So nationalized seminarians. That's a word that occurs with increasing frequency in modern and contemporary history. That is the technical term for when a government steals private property, domestic property. In our country, we call it eminent domain, but nationalize is a more general term that applies when governments steal private property within their borders. If they steal property from some other country, they call it annexing. Anyway, when Pope Clement XIV died, 55 cardinals were eligible to vote for his successor. 2 of them died during the sede vacante, while another 9 did not make the journey because they were too far away. The conclave began on the 5th of October, 1774, with 28 cardinals present. But late arrivals were admitted, eventually raising the number to 44, who actually elected the next pope. The cardinals sensed that Clement XIV's pontificate had been a disaster, but none were prepared with a readily apparent strategy to undo the damage, because the adversaries in this case were Catholic monarchs, not necessarily questioning fundamental theology. This was not exactly like the Protestant movement, which was rejecting the sacraments and fundamental theological points. But in this case, it was economic and jurisdictional, repudiating the full authority of the Pope, willing to accept him as a spiritual figurehead, but repudiating his jurisdictional authority within their realms. And then, of course, the economic motive of theft, just stealing church property to replenish their treasuries, because these monarchs had thrown away all of their money and wrecked their own economies. Anyway, none of the cardinals had this is what we need to do. So they, without absent a strategy that they wanted, they couldn't decide what character traits they wanted in the next pope. So the conclave of 1774 became the conclave of 1775. It went on for 134 days until, at length, on the 265th ballot, they decided to continue Clement XIV's policy of appeasement of the Catholic monarchies, rather than risking that they would lose another nation. So they elected one of his protégés, who was a cardinal. He was in the conclave. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Right. That's another issue, maintenance issue. We had a storm yesterday. Always something. So this guy was in the conclave. He was a cardinal, Giovanni Braschi, Braschi. He accepted election on the 15th of February, 1775, to serve as the 250th pope. He reigned for 24 years under the pontifical name Pius VI. Okay, this guy was born on Christmas Day, 1777, in Cesena in northeastern Italy, 9 miles from the Adriatic Sea. He was the eldest of the 8 children born to a count. He was an aristocrat, Count Marco Aurelio Tommaso of the House of Braschi. And his mother was Anna Teresa of the House of Bandi. It's Bandi. He was baptized in Cesena on December 27th with the name Angelo, Onofrio, Melchior, Natale, Giovanni, Antonio of the House of Braschi. After completing his studies at a Jesuit school, obviously before the suppression, the Jesuit school in Cesena, Braschi continued advanced studies at the University of Ferrara. He received a doctorate in both canon law and civil law in 1734. Unusually, for a man of his class, and as we've been following, he forfeited his firstborn rights in favor of ecclesiastical service. So this is a case where he chose to go into the church. He became private secretary to the papal legate, Cardinal Tommaso Ruffo, Ruffo, who was the bishop of Ostia. Ostia Antica was the port of Rome. This papal legate obviously is a diplomat, so, also administrative, but in this case, his duties involved Braschi in the papal diplomatic service. He did well. Pope Clement XIV rewarded his loyal service by appointment to the College of Cardinals on the 26th of April, 1773. In this capacity, he attended the conclave 2 years later, by which time everybody knew him. He was multilingual, highly cultured, an aesthete, and a patron of the arts. The hope of those who finally voted for him was that his prior experience as a diplomat, which had brought him into personal contact with most of the monarchs and foreign ministers of Europe, well, certainly all the ones from the Catholic countries, that would facilitate an end to the pressure exerted by these same Catholic monarchs to loot the church under cover of law. First, upon becoming Pope Pius VI, he continued an inherited project, converting an earlier pope, Pope Innocent VIII's Belvedere Palace, into a museum. Pope Clement XIV, his predecessor, initiated the renovation of that palace into a museum in 1771. Pius VI brought it to completion, and it's still there. Today it is the Pio Clementino Museum, housing works of Greek and Roman sculpture. So if you look up the Emperor Augustus, chances are one of the images you'll see is a statue of him with his arm, held out like this. That statue is in the gallery of that museum. And it's still, before COVID, the museum was open to the public, and if COVID ever goes away, maybe one day it will be again. A second project Pius VI inherited involved the centuries-long endeavor of draining the Pontine marshes. At the time, it was a morass. They had been fooling with this, literally for centuries. Back in the Romans were, always. Okay, so. See, I've got to enlarge this so I see it. Okay. All right, so here's Italy. All right, so you see, there's Rome there. So south of Rome, there was a 310 square mile morass of marsh, and that's called the Pontine marshes, and it extended about 30 miles south of Rome, southeast of Rome, from just east of Anzio down to Terracina. So connecting this back to earlier geographical landmarks, back from the patristics course, the famous Appian Way, the Via Appia, constructed in 312 BC. One of the reasons it was built, the way where it was built, surveyed where it was built, was to allow travelers to avoid the Pontine marshes. So it was is, like all the Roman road. I mean, it was a straight line, but it was on the inland side of those marshes. So travelers, you could look and see the marshes to one side, but you could go on the Via Appia, avoid them. Anyway, they fought with this for centuries, and Pius VI's contribution was he drained the parts near the Città della Pieve, Perugia, and Spoleto, in the course of which he also restored parts of the ancient Appian Way, which even by his time was 1,400 years old, and he expanded the two harbors of Terracina and Porto d'Anzio. Today, the whole region of what was the Pontine Marshes is still called the Agropontina. It is home to over 500,000 people, and primarily agricultural. They grow wheat, fruit, and grapes for wine. A third inheritance from the previous pontificate was one that changed the world, and that's what we'll spend the rest of this, and I'm sure it'll take at least one more, if not two more, to get through his pontificate, one that would change the world, and this is the lead up to the French Revolution, and the revolution itself, which began in Pius's reign. So, on May 10th, 1774, 1 year before Cardinal Bracci was elected Pope Pius VI, something happened in France. King Louis XV died. He lived so long that he outlived his own son, so he was followed by his grandson, who became King Louis XVI of France, the House of the Bourbon, the House de Bourbon, the Bourbon dynasty, which, so he was born in the Palace of Versailles, which is about 50 miles outside of Paris, on August 23rd, 1754. He is, Louis XVI turned out to be the last monarch of the old order. So if you read histories, they'll often leave it in the French, the Ancien Régime, which just means old rule, literally, but the old order, meaning feudalism. That he was the last king in France in which feudalism was the ascendant, governing principle of society. He was baptized Louis Auguste and given the title of the Duc de Berry. He was one of 7 children born to the Dauphin of France. The Dauphin, that's spelled D-A-U-P-H-I-N. That was the French analog to the Prince of Wales, meaning the Dauphin was the heir apparent to the throne. So the Dauphin, who, just to confuse things, was also named Louis. He had 7 children, and but as I said, the Louis XVI's father died before Louis XV. So at the age of 7, that happened when Louis Auguste was 7 years old. His father died. He received, and he had an older brother, but his older brother died in 1761. So at that point, Louis Auguste became the heir, and eventually Louis XVI. Anyway, he was royalty, so he received an excellent classical education, as it was understood at the time. He attained fluency in Latin, English, German, and Italian, along with his native French. He was physically active. He never missed a hunt, yet it was noted that even from his youth, he was enthusiastic about riding the horses for the hunt, but he had little interest in actually making the kills when they cornered the animals. In addition, his hobby was locksmithing. He was painfully shy, but considered likable. He did not have the monumental arrogance of his predecessor Louis XV, or the cosmic level arrogance of the previous Louis XIV. When Louis Auguste was age 11, his father, the Dauphin, died of tuberculosis on December 20th, 1765, making Louis Auguste heir apparent. His mother died 2 years later of the same disease on March 13th, 1767. 3 years later, we come back to a feudalism problem, one of them. The sacrament of matrimony was once more debased for one of the characteristic malfunctions of feudalism, specifically an incestuous political marriage. Louis Auguste was betrothed to his second cousin, an Austrian Habsburg princess, baptized Marie Antonia, but better known by the Gallicized form, the French form of her name, Marie Antoinette. Yes, this is Marie Antoinette. She was the youngest daughter of Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, Franz I, Holy Roman Emperor, and the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa, the House of Habsburg. Marie Antoinette was never academically inclined. Her tutors sorrowfully noted that even when she was a teenager, she could not even write her native German language with grammatical correctness. She was, however, a very gregarious person. She was talented in other ways. She was an accomplished musician. She could play the harp, the harpsichord, the flute, as well as sing and dance quite well. And she did have a good disposition, so she was a likable person. Louis and Antoinette had not met, of course. That's a bit of the feudalism problem. I mean, why would a future husband and wife have to meet, before the marriage? They had not met when they didn't even meet for the official marriage. They were married by proxy. I mean, they were in different countries. It's just, what did they think was going to? So they did. The farce took place in both countries. So Marie Antoinette, was. So they did the thing in Austria, so they could they could have an audience and see this. So it was in an Augustinian church in Vienna. And they were married by proxy. So Marie Antoinette went there on April 19th, 1770, and her brother, Antoinette's brother, stood in as proxy for the future Louis XVI. And then she traveled to France. And then the wedding farce was repeated in France for a French audience at the Palace of Versailles on May 16th, 1770. The groom was age 15. The bride was age 14. What could possibly go wrong with this situation? Both were brought up to be devout Catholics. I mean, despite the way they misuse marriage, as we've seen, that's been going on for centuries. So, I mean, we can't blame them for that. So they were brought up to be devout Catholics. And before Louis's older brother died, before he became the Dauphin, Louis had expressed interest in ecclesiastical life. So, if he had not ended up being the Dauphin, he would have preferred to be a churchman. Anyway, 4 years later, after the wedding, reproduction had still not occurred. The reigning king, Louis XV, died on May 10th, 1774, leaving as king Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. 14 days later, on May 24th, 1774, Louis gave Marie the Petit Trianon, which was a chateau on the grounds of Versailles. Gave it to her as a toy to play with. So this is a palace, as a dollhouse for her to play with. And she amused herself by constructing a full village around it for her and her ladies-in-waiting to play in. Rumors of the money she spent and the salacious descriptions of entertainments she hosted there were the beginning of a propaganda campaign against her, orchestrated by factions in France who resented a queen from the centuries-long enemy of the Habsburgs. You remember earlier for 300 years, the French the Habsburg Valois Wars and then the Habsburg Bourbon Wars, and so they were traditional enemies. Now this marriage was partially intended to end the 3 centuries of destructive, ruinous Franco-Austrian wars. Yet the damage of those wars, along with the wars of religion, along with the wars of dynastic expansion, which followed, and the most recent being the 7 Years' War, which we'll talk about in a minute, all of those together left Louis and Marie with a shattered economy. They inherited a shattered economy. So now, economy. I'm going to spend so much time on this really for 2 reasons. First, the French Revolution was triggered by economic. I mean, there were many other things involved, but the trigger was economic. Second, the French Revolution was one of those events, like World War II, after which nothing was ever the same, and that included economics. So it really did change things. So to understand, why the modern period begins with the French Revolution, part of that reason is economic. So bear with me. Okay, so all Western nations of the day followed the economic system that we now describe for convenience with the term mercantilism. 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 The most convenient definition of which was a centrally managed economy. It managed by a royal bureaucracy. Earlier in the 18th century, from 1716 through 1720, the monarchy attempted to rescue itself from an earlier economic collapse with paper money, printing paper money, and creating a central bank, a national bank, the Banque Royale. And that ended with the economic crash of the Mississippi Bubble, which at the time was a French colony. Now, we'll go into much more detail on that in the American history course in 4th year. But just for our purposes, that factoid is enough. France was temporarily rescued after the Mississippi Bubble from economic collapse by returning to bimetallism. It's not so. But when they tried the paper money experiment, they moved from the gold standard to paper money, and then they had the bubble and the collapse. So to fix it, instead of going back just to the gold standard, they employed bimetallism, meaning 2 metals. So both gold and silver were minted as legal tender with a fixed ratio in each coin, a fixed ratio of gold or silver in each coin. And so that became the legal tender to replace the experimental paper money. But no paper money is going to come back. But at the time, that's partially how they saved themselves. And the second way France saved itself at that point was from the astronomical profits of their slave-worked Caribbean colonies, specifically Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. And we're going to visit one of these later. So when it appeared that the crisis had passed, the economic crisis, the royal government then did its best to cripple the economic recovery through parasitism and tax theft. So the following this is what the French government did to its own population. The Thai. Now that's the French phonetics that they never pronounce the whole word. So Taille, which was a land tax, a property tax, a direct land tax on all property owners in France, except the aristocracy. A separate property tax was imposed on income produced from land use, which means crops sold, that are grown from the land, animals, bred on the land for sale. That's a separate tax, a tax on the land, and a separate tax on profits from the land use. There was the taillon, which was another tax for military expenditures. The gabelle was a national tax on salt. A separate tax was added, the maltout, on other consumer goods in addition to salt. But it was a separate tax on it. So salt had its own tax. Then there was a separate tax on other consumer goods. That still wasn't enough. So then they made up yet another consumer goods tax, but on luxury goods, a luxury goods tax, which included wine, tax on wine. It's amazing that the revolution didn't happen then. And then, hilariously, and then waste all the money. So they engage in tax theft. They, drain the resources from their own population, and then waste it. Building palaces and engaging in these pointless wars, which brought no profit in to the treasury, just expense. So, surprise, they have a deficit. So hilariously, the monarchy created a separate tax, a deficit tax. So the taxing the population because the government could not manage to pay its bills with all the previously mentioned taxes. So this is another tax on the population to defray the national deficit. It was calculated as a surtax on net earnings from land, property, commerce, industry, and official offices, the salaries of official offices. Payment of this surtax, the deficit surtax, was required in addition to paying all the other national taxes on those same commodities and transactions. Another tax they made up was the capitation. Caput means head, so it was a head tax. This means paying the government, paying the monarchy to exist. CAPITATION. They made that one up in 1695. Again, it's amazing the French Revolution waited as long as it did. And then that's just the national tax. That's just the monarchy. The monarchy's tax theft. Now, the local governments, the municipal governments, also engaged in tax theft. So the cities, had taxed all products entering the city. Just because, essentially an internal tariff. Local municipal governments, the cities and villages, also created a value-added tax on specialty goods. Another luxury tax. But in addition, that's not the same. The previous luxury tax was a national tax. This is a local tax, which they imposed to economically cripple their own artisans, their own skilled craftsmen. So this would be an additional tax on like clocks, artwork, custom furniture, perfume, clothing, like dressmakers, suit makers. And again, another tax was a sales tax on all transgressions at merchant fairs. Now, we think of fairs as something different, but for them, that was a big deal because that was their version of shopping malls. So it was a way, like we think of a fair as, like a carnival thing you just go to for fun. And their fairs certainly did have that, because they wanted to attract people. But it was also a place, where all these fairs, they'd move around the country. So most people couldn't travel the whole length of France, like go from Paris to Marseille to buy something. But at these fairs, merchants from Marseille, would travel. And so someone maybe could travel, say 20 miles from Paris to go to a fair and buy something. So it was not just, cotton candy and popcorn and rides at these fairs. It was, it was their shopping malls. So that, that Tax theft has to, In addition to these direct taxes, national and municipal, internal trade within the country was also looted by locally imposed tolls and shipping fees. So not taxes, you see. They're still taking your money, but it's not taxes. Assessed by municipalities or aristocrats who controlled important roads, ferries, bridges. Some of those privileges existed since the medieval period. So yet another category of vestigial problems of feudalism. To put a number to this. So a consignment of goods. Let's see, going from end to end. All right. Let's see. Where are we? I thought I just had it. Yeah, there it is. All right. I gotta be able to see. All right. So here in the south is Marseille. This is France. So this is the port of Marseille, which is on the Mediterranean. Now up here is Paris. All right. So essentially end to end in the country. All right. But still within the country. So before the revolution, goods, traveling, a consignment of goods, whatever it was, say wine, say wine from Marseille up to Paris, was stopped at 21 toll stations and assessed 34 separate fees. Now that's in addition to the sales tax we covered, depending on what it is, to the commodity tax we covered. If it was a luxury good, then there was the national tax on luxury goods, and then there would have been a municipal tax on luxury goods too. So that's not included in these 20. So it was stopped at 21 toll stations and assessed 34 separate fees in addition to all of the tax theft from the monarchy at the royal level, the national level, as well as municipalities. So these are just fees. They didn't call them taxes, but they're still taking your money. Now merchants, naturally, as to the extent that they could, passed on this expense to their customers through higher prices, such that by the time the revolution began, the average non-farming French family spent 70% of their income on subsistence food acquisition. The prices were so high, so the merchants, because the merchants were passing on the expense of all this tax theft. Now there were a couple of exceptions, and one of the exceptions was bread. The royal government, remember this is a managed economy, it's mercantilism. The royal government imposed price controls on bread and essentially nationalized the harvesting of grain to be used for bread, nationalized its transport, the grain to bakeries to convert it into bread, and assigned as a routine police task patrolling bakeries to ensure that the mandated price was not exceeded. Now, there were a few other exceptions, such as the royal monopoly on silk. But the bread subsidy, the bread monopoly, affected the entire population. I mean, even the king ate bread. So, by the reign of Louis XV, one of the inevitable problems of managed economies emerged. Now, this is Louis XVI's predecessor, the one right, not the Revolution king, the one before him. And the problem was that use of metal currency, either gold or gold and silver, naturally creates physical limits on the amount of liquid wealth available at any specific time, which is, of course, the whole point of using it, because then it becomes an objective measure of wealth. And also because gold does not rust. That's another reason. It doesn't oxidize. So there's two reasons to use it. But such a mathematical system, one based in reality, that cannot survive in an environment of multivalent arbitrary tax theft, such as that I just summarized was going on in 18th century France. Additionally, the French monarchy, as managed by Louis XIV and Louis XV, squandered resources on immense building projects, on payments to parasitic loyalists, and on a series of pointless wars, which, for the most part, France either lost or fought to a draw. But even victories, they derived no profit from the victories. So just spent money and got nothing for it. Now, I should say, like the luxury projects, they're often mocked, and anything you read about the French Revolution, they'll mock all of that. And it's not without cause, but it was jobs. So it wasn't completely wasted because these aristocrats weren't building those things themselves, so they did have to pay people, skilled craftsmen, and so it wasn't complete waste. There were some, it did do something for the economy, but not as much as updating a port facility would. So for our purposes, the most recent of the wars from Louis XV's perspective that France lost was the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in U.S. history. And we'll cover that in much more detail in the fourth year course. And actually, some of this is already up on my channel on the U.S. Catholicism, U.S. Catholic History playlist, because I taught that course last semester, if you're interested. But for now, it will suffice to understand that the 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with France suffering total defeat and humiliation at the hands of Great Britain. France lost its colony corresponding to present-day Canada that went to England, and France lost its colony extending in what is now the United States from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, the entire Mississippi River Valley. That went to Spain, and that's the Louisiana Territory. The French crown had incurred debts in the 7 Years' War, of course, partially to defend those territories. But since they lost those huge colonies, they ended up deprived of the revenue from those colonies to pay the debt, to repay the debts. Now, since the monarchy had already maimed its domestic economy with tax theft, the monarchy faced the prospect of imminent bankruptcy. Hoping to avoid this, Louis XV appointed a new Comptroller General of Finance in December of 1769, Abbot Joseph Terray, Terray. Typical product of feudalism, Terray was orphaned as a child, but was fortunate in having a wealthy physician uncle who purchased a benefice for him. And so he became abbot in commendam of the Abbey of Moulins, never once visiting his abbey, certainly not fulfilling any of his ecclesiastical duties. He just parasited off of the abbey, to make his income, and instead entered royal service, facilitated by the same uncle, who was physician to the one of his patients was the Duchess d'Orléans. So to simplify for our purposes, Abbot Terray, as Comptroller of Finance, was the senior fiscal official in the royal bureaucracy. This would be analogous to a combination of our Secretary of the Treasury, Budget Director, and Fed Chairperson. And Louis XVI inherited him. So Louis XVI's predecessor, the 15th, appointed this guy, and when the 15th died, this guy was still in that position, so Louis XVI inherited him. So Abbot Terray's solution to the latest economic collapse after the 7 Years' War was, first, repudiate the portion of the national debt that pertained to the lost colonies, And when creditors demanded repayment, refer them to England, which won the war. Say, well, yeah, England's running Canada now, so let them pay. Or if it was the Louisiana Territory, refer them to Spain. Say, oh, it's their colony now, let them pay. Second, suspend payment on government bonds issued on those colonies. Once again, referring bondholders to either England or Spain. And, of course, inevitably, the solution is going to involve increasing tax theft on the already impoverished population of France by recalculating the percentages up. Now, these actions did improve the royal balance sheet. You say, just erase, okay, well, we're just not going to pay that, so we're no longer holding that debt on our balance sheet. But they isolated the French economy from outside investment, as foreign merchants did not want to risk another repudiation of debt or bond obligations. So this theft left the government with only their own population to bleed. Thierry's increased tax theft antagonized everyone, as he sought to money from aristocrats as well as commoners. And when I gave the initial list, the aristocrats were exempt from some of those taxes, so he tried to reverse that. Louis XV supported his policies, but Louis XVI bowed to pressure. As we'll see, Louis XVI was not a fighter. He bowed to pressure from the aristocracy and relieved Abbe Thierry of his position as controller in May of 1774. Now, many of the bondholders, and as well as debt holders, were French citizens. They weren't all foreign. He wasn't just shafting foreign investors. And none of them forgot that it was a churchman who cost them their investment. So keep this in mind, as we see, how and why the revolution turned against the church as violently as it did. You see, because the church gets blamed for this. Now this guy, in name, he was an ecclesiastic. Of course, he was an abbot. He dressed, an ecclesiastical. But to call this guy a churchman, that's a joke. It's a farce. But that's part of the feudalism problem. Having these guys without a vocation at all, holding both high church office and high ecclesiastical office without a vocation and not even a pretense at fulfilling his ecclesiastical duties. Yet because he was a churchman, the church gets blamed for this. And it's not the church's, but this is feudalism. This is a feudalism problem. Anyway, all right. Believe it or not, this is how two extremes in Western history emerged. One extreme is homicidal revolution. The other extreme is capitalism. I know, you think I'm making this up, but no. But on August 24th, 1774, Louis XVI appointed a new guy as controller of finance. This was Robert Jacques Turgot, Turgot. He was a baron. He was an aristocrat, a lay aristocrat, the Baron de Laune. So he replaced the dismissed Abbe Thierry. Turgot was a pupil of Francois Quesnay, Quesnay. Quesnay was a physician turned economist who pioneered, at least theoretically, meaning he wrote about it, a replacement for mercantilism, meaning a replacement for the central control of national commerce, of the planned economy. In 1758, he published the Tableau économique, economic table, which was the first attempt to produce a mathematical analysis of the economy of the nation. And he started using that term, economy, in this way. So it's derived from a Greek word. Oikos is the word for house. Oikomenos is the word for household. So economy pertains to the management of a household. And, by extension, the nation, the national household. So his the economic table was used as the basis for a new economic philosophy intended to replace mercantilism, which he called physiocracy. PHYSIOCRACY, which means government of nature, meaning the natural law, government based on the natural law. The foundational axiom of physiocracy, as articulated by Quesnay in 1758, was that by nature, gold and silver had no intrinsic value. Only value attributed by common agreement. Instead, he argued, what does by nature have intrinsic value is land, because land can be used to produce food, either by means of crops or raising livestock, which is a natural necessity. Quesnay further used the analogy of blood circulation in the body. So remember, he was originally a physician. And that had already been established by William Harvey in 1628. So analogously, he said the body of the nation prospered when wealth was continually circulated by means of trading the produce of one land for the produce of another. For this reason, Quesnay asserted that the mercantilist management of the economy must be eliminated because it impeded the blood flow of the nation. Now, obviously, this entailed eliminating or drastically reducing the exsanguination of the nation through tax theft. Physiocracy also included elimination of vestigial feudalism, which granted to aristocrats and municipalities the right to impede trade through tolls and fees. So this is the origin. It's attributed to Adam Smith with the capitalism, but we'll see that Smith met all these people. The phrase laissez-faire, laissez-passer, which means, let it alone, or let it be done, just let it happen, and let it pass. Laissez-faire. So faire, F-A-I-R-E, is the means to do, to make or to do or to happen. Laissez-passer means let it pass. So it's referring to, ceasing the interdiction of domestic trade through these arbitrary, the looting of these fees and tolls. Laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Leave it alone, let it pass. Quesnay's arguments represented an important step toward contemporary economics. In 1766, as we shall see, David Hume and Adam Smith met Quesnay on a trip to France and one of Quesnay's students, Robert Jacques Turgot, the very same guy we just met who succeeded Abbé Terray as controller of finance. Adam Smith, adopted some of these concepts of physiocracy in his economic philosophy of free market capitalism, which we'll talk about in due course. So they met in the 1760s, but Turgot became controller of finance on August 24th, 1774. So he was in a position to make the first attempt at implementing physiocracy at a national level. The attempt to replace mercantilism, replace the managed economy. So here's some of Quesnay's thoughts in his own words. This is from the Tableau Économique, number 68. Quote, "We see, by what has just now, how the cultivation of land, manufacturers of all kinds, and all branches of trade depend on a mass of capital, or the accumulation of personal property, which, having been at first advanced in each of these different branches, ought to return to them again every year with a regular profit. That is, the capital to be again invested, and advanced in the continuation of the same enterprises, and the profits employed for the greater or less subsistence of the undertakers. Now, that's a translation of the meaning. It doesn't. This is not morticians, but referring to those taking the risk, those undertaking the risk of investment. Entrepreneurs, I suppose, would be a better way to phrase it today. It is this continued advance and return which constitutes what ought to be called the circulation of money. This useful and fruitful circulation, which animates all the labor of society, which supports all the motion, and is the life of the body politic, and which is with great reason compared to the circulation of the blood in the human body. For if by any disorder in the course of the expenses of the different orders of society, the entrepreneurs cease to draw back their advances with such profit as they have a right to expect, it is evident they will be obligated to reduce their investment. That the total of the labor, of the consumption of the fruits of the earth, of the productions, and of the revenue would be equally diminished. That poverty will succeed to riches, and that the common workman, ceasing to find employment, will fall into the deepest misery. On September 13th, 1774, 1 month after his appointment as comptroller, Turgot eliminated price controls on grain and ordered the police to open the warehouses where grain had been stored according to the prior government policy of managing bread distribution. Now, this is the first attempt at converting from a mercantile to a capitalist economy. Turgot, therefore, did not have a comprehensive understanding of the process he was changing, and neither did the king. Neither of them had ever served in the military. Louis XVI became king too young for him to have served. Otherwise, he would have. That was just the custom among the royalty and aristocracy that they would spend some time in the military. I mean, they weren't digging ditches, but they still, at least he would have been in the camp and he would have seen something. Specifically, he would have been exposed to the logistical necessities of transportation to feed large numbers of people. But without even this limited awareness, neither King Louis nor Controller Turgot considered that by canceling the price controls, salary payment automatically ceased to the guys with wagons and barges required to move the grain from the field to the bakeries and from the bakeries to the markets. Once the warehouses were empty, no one was bringing any more. As the unemployed men were not going to work for free, the result was so catastrophic that the French Revolution nearly happened 15 years early. In French history, this is called the Flower War, which had many characteristics of a civil war. But in this case, it was not really, because it was not seeking to overthrow the government. It was panic. It was hunger. It was, a series of desperation riots. Between April and May of 1775, 313 distinct hunger riots occurred throughout France, requiring 25,000 troops to suppress. The lesson for economic history was that an entirely managed economy cannot be transformed to capitalism by altering only one category of commerce without modifications to account for second and third order effects, such as, guys aren't going to work if you don't pay them. Nevertheless, Turgot was officially blamed and dismissed. No one forgot the panic of empty warehouses and no wagons or barges to replenish them. Now, few understood the exact sequence of events responsible for this. So most blamed the king for being either stupid or careless or corrupt or all three. The uprisings, the Flower War, was only crushed with the cooperation of the aristocracy because they filled the Army and the Navy officer corps. In fact, as we'll see, one of the to be a senior officer, meaning a major up in the Army, you had to be an aristocrat. You had to be able to demonstrate, some aristocratic lineage. So, I mean, the Army stayed loyal, in other words, and that's largely because the officer corps stayed loyal, and they were all aristocrats. They used Louis XVI's moment of vulnerability in the Flower War to extort advantages for themselves, such as a return of the privileges and exemptions that Abbé Terray had revoked during the reign of his predecessor, Louis XV, meaning reimposing the malfunctions of feudalism, the economic malfunctions. So the result of the Flower War was reimposition of management of the economy by the royal bureaucracy, simultaneously undermined by the restored malfunctions of feudalism. The economic disintegration of France continued, along with limited foreign investment in the National Bank and limited purchase of government bonds because of their earlier repudiation of those by Abbé Terray, so it was not a safe investment. The French monarchy, survived only 14 more years. It survived, on tax theft of the population, and again from profits of its slave work plantation colonies in the Caribbean, one of which, present-day Haiti, we'll have occasion to visit later. 3 months after the Flower War, Pope Pius VI was able to perform what turned out to be among the last of his purely religious actions as Pope prior to the West being sucked into the abyss by the looming economic catastrophe in France. On the 17th of August, 1775, Pope Pius VI declared the vision of Our Lady of Shiluva to be worthy of belief. That's Siluva, which translates to Our Lady of the Pine Woods. This was, is an icon of Our Lady, the Virgin, in Shiluva is Lithuania, in Lithuania. A shrine of the same name exists, still dedicated to her, so it has a long history. The Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania was pagan, but he was baptized Catholic in 1387 when he married a Polish princess, Jadwiga. She was queen of neighboring Poland. And that was the condition of the marriage. She was Polish, and she was Polish Catholic, and so to marry her, he became Catholic. Together, they facilitated the conversion of Lithuania from paganism to Christianity. In 1457, a Lithuanian nobleman named Petras funded construction of a church in Shiluva, which was a town west of the center of the country, under the patronage of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the apostles Saints Peter and Bartholomew. For the occasion, an icon was sent from Rome for the new church, painted by an anonymous iconographer, which is usually the case, they were anonymous, in the Hodegetria style. I forget what I've talked about with which class, but Hodegetria is it's a transliteration of the Greek word. In English, it's Hodegetia. So the literal translation is "She who points the way." It was a recognized style of sacred art in iconography, and later in stained glass windows and in Western usage as statues. Would be Our Lady of the Way. So it's Our Lady holding the baby Jesus, and she's kind of like pointing to him. So Our Lady of the Way, pointing the way. as a source of salvation. The most familiar version of this in the West is Our Lady of Perpetual Help. So, if you Google, icon of Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and you see that's an example of the Hood of Getria, Our Lady of the Way. So this icon, Our Lady of Shaluva, was rendered in that style. So all the details were not identical to Our Lady of Perpetual Help icon, but recognizably, Our Lady's in the same pose holding the baby Jesus. This icon was saved from the anti-Catholic vandalism of the protest movement, the Protestant movement. As we saw, they would incinerate, destroy, all the Catholic art they could. The church was destroyed, but the icon was saved and hidden. Later, in the year 1608, children in Shaluva received an infused grace in the form of a vision of Our Lady, silently weeping. Unlike other visions, she was not speaking, did not have a message. Well, the weeping was a message, but she didn't have a verbal message. So the icon was retrieved, a small wooden church was constructed in 1622, and that was later replaced with a larger church in 1641. So Pope Pius VI confirmed the authenticity of the vision on August 17th, 1775, meaning that the icon and the church it was in became a legitimate, indulgenced pilgrimage destination. And that led to the construction of a Baroque basilica, consecrated in 1786. And miraculously, it survived all the wars, subsequent wars. 2 world wars, and astonishing. It was visited by Pope, now Saint John Paul II in 1993, and by Pope Benedict XVI in 2008. So if you look it up, it's a beautiful, beautiful church. 1776, Pope Pius VI added the sacristy to St. Peter's Basilica. Now, this was part of the ongoing rebuilding of the new basilica to replace Constantine's original St. Peter's, which was torn down by Pope Julius II, as we covered earlier in the course. The sacristy of the original church, Constantine's church, has been lost. Pius VI sacristy is at the entrance to the necropolis of St. Peter's. In an aerial view, it's near the south side of the current basilica. But to get to it, you actually have to enter the church. So when you go in St. Peter's Church, you enter it from the piazza, go down the left aisle, and keep going until you find the monument of Pope Pius VIII above the door. But it was actually Pope Pius VI who built the sacristy and commissioned it in 1776. At the entrance, to get to the sacristy, you will find an earlier 16th century statue of St. Andrew, sculpted with 5 different types of marble. It's astonishing how they could do that. To the right of the entrance is another marble plaque with the names of 148 popes. Now, I know one of you who watches this. I don't know. I don't have permission to use your name, but you know who you are. When upon seeing this at a visit to Rome, recognized that there were some names missing. But not to worry. That's not a list of all popes, just the list of the popes buried in St. Peter's. So it's 148 popes are buried in St. Peter's. So the names are there. Anyway, go through the door. Passing through the entrance brings one into a corridor, which provides access to areas, some of which are public, some of which are restricted. The sacristy itself is an octagonal footprint, decorated with 8 columns, liberated from Hadrian's villa in Tivoli. And the coat of arms of Pope Pius VI is the centerpiece on the floor. So, seminarians, now, well, of course, dependent on COVID, if that ever goes away, I'll say before COVID, before St. Peter's is open to the public, it is open for priests. So you can go into the sacristy and say Mass. They usually do two rounds, 6 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. And it's first come, first serve. And they'll bring you to the altars. Now, there are a few of the altars that are reserved, and you have to schedule those in advance. But if you don't do that, they'll bring you to some side altar. Don't bother bringing your own vestments, because they have no trust of Americans. They think everything we do is tasteless, and so you have to wear their vestments. And they provide altar servers. You just tell them what language, and then they have the books and everything. They have the water, the wine, the host, and the server will bring you to whatever altar they're going to permit you to use. And there's a book. You sign in the book, and the book is kept forever. So you literally will have your name in history. Hopefully COVID ends, so you'll get to do that. All right, in the same year that he commissioned this in 1776, in the same year, the revolutions began, which characterized the beginning of the modern period that shaped the rest of Pius VI's life until it cost him his life. He actually died, because of this. So to give us a frame of reference, the following has to be kept in mind, because this catastrophe, this was a theme park for the demonic. And it synthesizes so many developments that really, some of which began with the fall of the Roman Empire that we saw in the Patristic Discourse. So one element to keep in mind: neither the secular nor the religious portions of society ever truly recovered from the ending of the Middle Ages. Even though there was much warfare in the medieval world, and there were many, many, many conflicts between the papacy and various monarchs. Nevertheless, there had been a fundamental agreement regarding the essential unity and the essential necessity of the unity of the secular and the sacred spheres of society. With the removal of those fundamental assumptions, neither the church nor the state had managed to find a long-term way to function in harmony with each other. And one could argue that that's still the case, that we still have not, church and state still have not found a long-term way to function in harmony with each other. Second category, second element to keep in mind. The medieval world lasted for 1,000 years, from the legalization of Christianity in 313 until, depending on how one counts it, one could point to the fall of the last Crusader kingdom of Acre in the Holy Land in 1291. Others would put it at the beginning of the Avignon period, 1305. But, 1,000 years is a good round number. Yet it took another 200 years for the medieval world to completely disintegrate, from 1305 to 1517, when the Protestant movements began, and that certainly destroyed the medieval world. This means that today, we are only 500 years into the attempt to find a replacement for the medieval world. By the reign of Pope Pius VI, the West was only 250 years into the attempt. So far, all attempts have been abysmal failures. Never, since the Protestant movement began, has the West ever again attained a unified, generally understood and accepted set metaphysics, a set of truths about the relationship between the secular and the sacred. Third element. The protest movement, the Protestant movement, began in 1517, as we covered, with Luther nailing up the 95 Theses. 2 years later, 1519, the first homicides occurred within that protest movement. This was followed by vandalism and arson of Catholic sacred art, sacred buildings, theft of sacred vessels to be melted down, stolen, civil wars within every single nation where the movement appeared, and international wars between nations that wished to remain Catholic against those that embraced the protest movement. The earliest date possible to identify as the end of the wars of religion is 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, meaning a 130-year revolving carousel of carnage blamed on religion. This prompted a reaction in the late 17th and into the 18th centuries, which regarded a religious view of the world as unsafe. Atheists, of course, concluded that the world would be better off with no religion at all. But even those who retained faith were led to agree by the catastrophe of the protest movements and the following wars, to agree that public welfare is better served by separating church and state. Reason, then, was seen as a protection from religion. Science was elevated as a way to rescue the world from faith. One long-term result was that the church became all the more dependent on the surviving Catholic monarchies that continued to accord the church established status, meaning the Catholic Church would be the official church. Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, Austria, Bavaria, Hungary, Savoy, Bohemia. In those countries, Poland also, and Lithuania, but as we'll see in the 18th century, those got conquered and partitioned out of existence, even though the populations remained Catholic. In those countries, the feudalism problems were perpetuated. Clergy simultaneously holding office in both church and government, younger sons and daughters being sent into the church for political and economic gain without regard for the vocational disposition of those people, and debasement of the sacrament of matrimony for the same reasons, arranged by families for political and economic gain without regard to the disposition of those involved. Another long-term result, which brings us to the French Revolution during the reign of Pius VI, is that anti-authoritarian elements in these nations, the Catholic nations, regarded the church and monarchy as inseparable allies, the throne and altar. So those who wished to replace hereditary monarchy with another form of government accepted as axiomatic that the church must also be either destroyed or crushed into insignificance. Fourth, the underlying fallacy of this entire chain of reasoning can be traced to the assumption that the wars of religion had been the fault of a religious view of the world. In fact, as we covered in more detail when we introduced the protest movements, those wars were driven by political and economic considerations, with cynical leaders manipulating the church, religion, and the faith of their people to achieve other objectives. This is clear because after the wars of religion ended in 1648, the European murder fest continued with a nearly uninterrupted series of dynastic wars for the rest of the 17th and into the 18th century, motivated by the usual reasons, the desire to steal land and resources from other nations. But it was more direct, so they stopped using religion as an excuse because people stopped buying it. Fifth, because of the intellectual and theological distortions we have been covering since the course began, the attempts to find a stable replacement for the medieval synthesis have never aligned in a lasting way. The reason is that it is not possible to align the post-medieval intellectual and theological fragmentation into a coherent unity, because God intends faith and reason to operate together. The post-medieval world has, on the whole, rejected that truth. The separation of faith from reason, the quarantining of church from society, has created a pendulum effect, operating simultaneously on two axes. Axis number one: the pendulum within the church has swung from the extreme of wanting to be completely united with the larger society, even seeing secular achievements as superior to church contributions, to the opposite extreme of wishing to remain separated in a worldwide monastic mentality, seeing the church as a protection from the secular, as see that the world has chosen Satan, in other words, and so that the church is a refuge from that. Second axis: the pendulum within society, within the secular, has swung from the extreme of wanting to use the church as an instrument of social and political control to the opposite extreme of seeking to annihilate religion altogether. Okay, so the first of the revolutions in the modern period was ours, the American Revolution. It was a direct result of the pointless and costly destruction of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in American history, which wrecked the economies of all involved, including the victors. Now, we already saw how France tried to adapt and how that utterly failed. Great Britain actually won the war, but their economy was also wrecked. So they decided they had to, fix it, and they decided to apply tax theft. And really a similar strategy as the French, but since Great Britain won the war, they still had colonies, so they employed the tax theft on the American, the 13 colonies on the east coast of North America, following the logic that at least one theater of the 7 Years' War was there, and so that part of the cost that Great Britain invested in the war, and therefore the debt accrued, was to defend those 13 colonies. So it seemed, from London, it seemed fair that the 13 colonies contribute to defraying the cost of their own defense. To this end, in 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It's a form of tax theft. This is all just made up. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, when you think about it, they want to raise revenue. They're just making up ways to steal from their own population. So the Stamp Act required the purchase of an official government stamp on all documents, books, and newspapers. The fury of the colonist at this sufficed to force the repeal of the act, but its object of fleecing the colonies was then translated into the Townshend Act, which imposed tariffs and duties on imports. So just another form of tax theft. This led many landowners and intellectuals to form correspondence society, or the committees of correspondence, as they were called. And here some of the names: Samuel Adams, John Adams, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and others, fomenting discontent with the existing condition of the colonies under the slogan "No taxation without representation." In 1773, the year we began with, when Clement XIV suppressed the Jesuits, American colonists dumped the tea cargo of 3 British ships into Boston Harbor as a tax protest. And the 13 colonies sent delegates to the First Continental Congress, suspending trade with England until their grievances were satisfied. Those grievances were not satisfied within the framework of ordinary governance, so the American Revolution began. The Battle of Lexington on April 18, 1775, 2 months after Pope Pius VI was elected. Now, we'll cover this in far more detail in the 4th-year course on Catholicism in U.S. history. So for now, we'll move on. Connecting back to earlier references, capitalism was invented by Adam Smith in the same year, 1776, as a development building on the foundation of physiocracy. And remember, Smith, he had met Quesnay and Turgot. He was able to observe what happened, with Turgot's attempt to implement physiocracy. So he saw those mistakes. He learned the lessons, and so all of that was synthesized into his famous works. The best known is The Wealth of Nations. Anyway, we'll get to that. So Adam Smith was born in Scotland, named for his father, who was employed as a public prosecutor and controller of customs in Kilkenny, Scotland. So, So now he traveled, as we'll see. Notice, okay, Scotland. Here's England. Ireland, and Scotland is up here. See Edinburgh, Glasgow. Here's England, and then here's France. He as we'll see, he traveled to France at one point, but Scotland's up here. All right. He was named for his father. In 1720, Adam the Elder, Adam Sr., his father, married Margaret Douglas, who was from a landowning but non-aristocratic family. Adam Sr. died 2 months before Adam Younger was born. The family was well provided for, so Adam was able to attend the Berg School, learning English reading and composition, as well as Latin, mathematics, and history. Smith then enrolled in the University of Glasgow, which I showed you where that was, in Scotland, where he studied moral philosophy under Francis Hutchinson, who was an Irish Protestant who went there to teach. Officially, Adam Smith was a member of the Church of Scotland, which, as we saw earlier, was Presbyterian. But in reality, Smith fully embraced the Enlightenment, and the reason, as taught in the 18th century in general, and by his professor, Francis Hutchinson in particular. Meaning he internalized a profound reverence for the importance of liberty and the right of free speech, neither of which existed under monarchies in the way that we understand those terms today. Monarchies are not free societies, at least not in the 18th century. Excelling in his studies, after graduation, Adam Smith earned a scholarship for advanced studies at Balliol College, Oxford University, where he remained until 1746. In 1748, he returned to Scotland. He commenced a series of public lectures on the grounds of the University of Edinburgh, sponsored by the local Philosophical Society. Covered a wide range of topics, and he began putting in these, of course he wrote them all out in advance, so he began putting language to his belief that natural liberty was the endowment of every human being, and therefore was a constituent requirement for all truly human endeavors: ethical, economic, political, moral. In this context, in 1750, Smith had a life-changing encounter with a fellow Scot named David Hume, Hume. Then, Hume was working as a librarian at the University of Edinburgh. They became lifelong friends. Neither of them ever married, and Hume actually named Smith executor of his estate, and vice versa, but it just so happened that Hume died first. In the following year, 1751, Adam Smith received a professorship at the University of Glasgow, teaching logic. In the following year, 1752, he was elected a member of the Philosophical Society of Edinburgh. In 1753, he became head of the Moral Philosophy Department at the university, where he remained for the next 13 years. Smith published in 1759 a book titled The Theory of Moral Sentiments, embodying some of his Glasgow lectures, supplemented with additional research. In this book, Smith critically examined the moral reasoning of his time, but prescinding from religion, as he was functionally probably an atheist, certainly a deist, but probably an atheist. But he was applying, in other words, he was trying to propose a theory of morality without Christian metaphysics, without the belief in an objective right and wrong ordained by God. So in the absence of that, is it possible to have a theory of moral sentiments that is always and everywhere true? Smith proposed that human conscience is constructed within a dynamic process of ongoing, interactive, social relationships. It is our nature, meaning it is human nature as pack animals, to seek mutual sympathy of sentiments. Adopting the pagan anthropology of Aristotle, that we are born as blank slates, and influenced by Hume's empiricism, Adam Smith argued that we, as humans, become aware of ourselves by observing the interactions of others with each other and with ourselves. The utilitarian need, the practical need to survive within a group, compels most to develop recognizable mutual sympathy of sentiments, moral sentiments. Those become habits of behavior. And those habits are what had been named previously the conscience, the human conscience. Not everyone is able to do this. Those who fail are ostracized from the pack, from the group, and eliminated as criminals, either incarcerated or worked to death or, tortured or murdered, whatever. So this is not in any, this guy is not, technically he was Christian, he was a member of the, a Christian church, but this is not, it certainly, absolutely is not Catholic. But I don't, anyway, this view of conscience is, without reference to the divinity, is an enlightenment. It's a rationalist analysis, so just keep that in mind. I'm only covering it in this detail because Adam Smith affected and continues to affect so much of the world. 3 years later, in 1762, the University of Glasgow conferred on Smith the title Doctor of Laws, the LLD. At the end of 1763, he accepted an offer from Charles Townshend, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who came up with the Townshend Act, the Stamp Act. Accepted an offer from that guy to tutor his stepson, Henry Scott, the young Duke of Buccleuch, Buccleuch. Smith resigned from his university position in 1764 to take the tutoring position, which paid twice his teaching salary and included paid travel to accompany the young Duke on his grand tour. That is how Smith was able to meet Quesnay and Turgot, as mentioned earlier, which introduced Smith to physiocracy and the condition in France. So he not only got the theory, but also got to see the what was going on in France. He was appalled. He was a Scot. So very frugal, a frugal Scot. Apart from anything else, he was appalled at the profligate spending of the royalty and aristocracy in France, with the economy in ruins, and was genuinely perplexed by the government policies that retarded any possibility of economic prosperity. The French experience prompted thoughts in Smith that influenced his articulation of capitalism. The distinction For example, the distinction between productive and non-productive elements in the economy, and the necessity of unimpeded commerce. In 1766, Smith's European tour was abruptly canceled when his student's younger brother died, and he returned home. Smith also went back home, in his case to Kilcaldy, Scotland, and spent the next decade working on his most famous work, his most famous book. In May of 1773, Smith was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of London, and in 75 elected a member of the Royal Literary Club. And then it happened. He published an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations in 2 volumes on March 9th, 1776. Books in the first volume included books 1 to 3, and the second volume books 4 and 5. The first edition sold out in 6 months. 5 editions of The Wealth of Nations were published during Smith's lifetime. In 1778, Smith was appointed to a post as Commissioner of Customs in Scotland, and he was living with his mother, but he lived with her for until she died. All right, yeah, I'll skip that. Anyway, he died in Edinburgh. I'll leave it at that. He died in Edinburgh in 1790, July 17th. Now, for The Wealth of Nations. It's long, very, very long, and very, very tightly reasoned. It takes a lot of time to read it. So I'll just summarize the argument in a few points. First, regulations on commerce, Smith argued, are counterproductive. A nation's true wealth consists of the circulation of goods and services that it creates. So today this would be, we call this the gross national product. Now, this is an insight borrowed from physiocracy, but with a distinction. So the physiocrats believed that land was the only, true source of wealth. Whereas for Smith, he did not reject the proposition that land has intrinsic value, but for him, value and wealth are two different things. That a nation's wealth consists in the process of circulating goods and services and wealth. So for him, land in itself is while it always has potential value, that it only has actual value if it's being used for an activity that turns a profit, either growing crops, raising animals, or if there's a mine or on the property, or if there's water that goes through it, a mill on the water, bridge over the water. It's the process for him that makes the wealth. Second, productive capacity is increased by division of labor into smaller tasks, enabling accumulation of capital. A factory in which assembling a wagon is divided among 20 men can produce more wagons at a faster pace than a workshop with 1 or 2 carpenters assembling the totality of each wagon themselves. The greater number of wagons can all be sold to pay the extra men and still bring in a profit. This was Smith's own insight. Now, this is often attributed to the later Henry Ford, with the assembly line. And Henry Ford did develop that, but the insight was Smith's. Now, the technology didn't yet exist. The engineering had not been perfected yet for a real assembly line. But the idea of the division of labor was Smith's. Third, accumulation of liquid capital, meaning money available for investment, is more important for national prosperity, in Smith's view, than the specific products it creates. So this is parallel to his insight about land, that land always has potential value, but it only has capital. It only produces capital if it's making money, like if it produces crops that can be sold, or if animals are bred on it or something like that. Then it's produced something that can be invested. Otherwise, the land is just there. It's potential value, but it doesn't. It's not contributing to the economy. Free economic agents will not accumulate. That's us, people. Will not accumulate capital if they believe it will be stolen through confiscatory taxation and arbitrary fees. They'll figure, why bother? Why work if we're not going to get to benefit from it? So for Smith, national prosperity requires protection of capital from parasitic drain, either from aristocrats, municipalities, or monarchy. Partially, Smith derived this from physiocracy, but added an insight from the Flower War disaster, that liquid capital must be available at all levels of the nation and not introduced in one category of the economy at a time. Fourth, supply and demand is the only rational basis, in Smith's mind, for production and pricing. This is automatic, changing with the unfolding situations of life, which for the most part cannot be predicted. Hence, centrally managed economies are doomed to fail, as was the French managed economy that he saw in person. Fifth, automatic adaptation to supply and demand can only take place in an environment of free trade and competition. Government management of the economy through monopolies, subsidies, tax theft, tariffs, all distort the organic process of supply and demand. Private distortion of the economy, Smith warned, must also be forbidden. For him, this would mean guilds, or like trade unions, as well as aristocratic privileges dating from feudalism. That all has to go. Smith used the term invisible hand to describe this automatic regulation of the free market. This was another insight that can be traced to physiocracy, but refined by Smith after observing the Flower War. Free markets must be permitted at all levels of the economy. He saw, in retrospect, that Turgot's mistake was opening grain to the free market without making provision for opening the transportation sector to the free market. The result was a supply existing in the fields, demand existing in the city, but no way to connect the two. All right, the invisible hand. I'll give you a couple of quotes since it's such a characteristic insight. And one example from each of his one example from the first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. This is part 4, chapter 1, and this is again just an excerpt. Quote, "And it is well that nature imposes upon us in this manner. It is this deception which rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. It is this which first prompted them to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths, and to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life, which have entirely changed the whole face of the globe, have turned the rude forest of nature into agreeable and fertile plains, made the trackless and barren ocean a new fund of subsistence, and the great high road of communication to the different nations of the earth. The earth, by these labors of mankind, has been obliged to redouble her natural fertility and to maintain a greater multitude of inhabitants. It is to no purpose that the proud and unfeeling landlord views his extensive fields without a thought for the wants of his brethren. In imagination consumes himself the whole harvest that grows upon them. The homely and vulgar proverb that the eye is larger than the belly never was more fully verified than with regard to him. All right, I'll interrupt there and say, I'm just taking an excerpt because, for the sake of time. Earlier you'd see the connection, so I'll just say that another malfunction he saw in the economy was hoarding. That those who artificially, in this case the landlord, artificially hoards the harvest, hoards the harvest for the purpose of artificially raising the price of the market. He saw that as because that's a distortion. It impedes the circulation. And while it could produce short-term profit, he saw it as a long-term detriment because supply and demand is not operating organically. It's being interfered with. And he saw that from experience, he observed that often the hoarded crops just rot, that they never are put in circulation. So that's capital that's not being accrued. Okay, back to the quote. The capacity of his stomach, meaning the landlord, the corrupt landlord, bears no proportion to the immensity of his desires, and will receive no more than the meanest peasant. The rest he is obliged to distribute among those who prepare, in the nicest manner, that little which he himself makes use of. Among those who fit up the palace in which this little is to be consumed, among those who provide and keep in order all the different baubles and trinkets which are employed in the economy of greatness, all of whom thus derive from his luxury and caprice that share of the necessities of life which they would in vain have expected from his humanity or his justice. The produce of the soil maintains at all times nearly that number of inhabitants which it is capable of maintaining. Now, again, to interrupt here, obviously he's writing in the 18th century, so, modern developments in fertilizer and, all that, have increased productive capacity, in a way that he could not have possibly foreseen in the 18th century. Back to the quote. The rich only select from the heap what is most precious and agreeable. They consume little more than the poor. Now, that's misleading. I think what he means is in actual food. Like a rich guy might be able to down a whole chicken, but so could a poor guy. But, there are limits. It's not infinite. So, the rich obviously did consume more, but he's talking about by nature that the body of a rich person does not require more calories than the body of a poor person. In fact, it's probably the reverse because the poor person has to work more. And in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, he's critiquing the French aristocrats that he's, though they mean only their own convenience, though the sole end which they propose from the labors of all the thousands whom they employ be gratification only of their own vain and insatiable desires, they divide with the poor the product of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessities of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. When Providence divided the earth among the few lordly masters, it neither forgot nor abandoned those who seemed to have been left out in the partition. These last two enjoy their share of all that is produced. In what constitutes the real happiness of human life, they are in no respect inferior to those who would seem so much above them. In ease of body and peace of mind, all the different ranks of life are nearly upon a level, and a beggar who suns himself by the side of the highway possesses that security which kings are fighting for. So that could certainly be critiqued, but secondly, every individual who employs his capital in the support of domestic industry necessarily endeavors so to direct that industry that its produce may be of the greatest possible value. The produce of industry is what it adds to the subject, or materials upon which it is employed. In proportion as the value of this produce is great or small, so will likewise be the profits of the employer. But it is only for the sake of profit that any man employs a capital in the support of industry, and he will always, therefore, endeavor to employ it in the support of that industry, of which the produce is likely to be of the greatest value, or to exchange for the greatest quantity, either of money or of other goods. End quote. Okay. Actually, all right. I'm going to stop here because I see how if the thing is too long, it sometimes it won't upload. It'll just get caught in an endless loop. So I'm going to stop here. I'll just pick up with Adam Smith next time. So for the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.